Hi guys. Tonight we're going somewhere ordinary history rarely dares to go. Sometimes the loudest names hide the quietest secrets. Sometimes behind the shimmer of a crown, there's the shadow of loneliness. Tonight we won't just speak of an empress, but of a woman known by all, and truly known by none. But before you get too comfortable, please like this video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy my stories. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see who has joined us. Catherine the Great. Thousands of books have been written about her, but some things never made it to the page. Too personal, too dangerous, too unofficial. Tonight, we'll open diaries that may never have been meant to be read. We'll hear her thoughts. We'll walk the corridors where footsteps have long faded. And maybe, just maybe, we'll begin to understand not just how she ruled, but how she survived in a world where trust was worth more than a throne. Ready? Then wrap yourself in something warm, and let's begin. Sometimes, history doesn't vanish with violence. Sometimes it simply fades, quietly, without warning. A page missing here, a diary misplaced there, a fire perhaps, or a decision no one ever confessed to making. Tonight, we drift not into the wars or palaces, not into the battles she won or the men she loved, but into the silence Catherine the Great left behind. A silence that hums softly behind every painting, every speech, every carefully constructed myth. You're not here to study. You're here to feel. To step gently into the shoes of a woman who ruled an empire, and still wondered, late at night, who she truly was. Let your breath soften. Let the weight of the day fall from your shoulders. And together we'll walk through the shadows of the Winter Palace, not to uncover everything, but to understand what was never meant to be found. This is the lost voice of Catherine the Great, and more. Why it was hard to be a woman in power, daily life in Catherine's court. Imagine waking up not to the warmth of privacy, but to the sounds of servants just beyond the door, the rustle of skirts, the scent of powder and starch, the expectation that, from the moment your eyes open, you will perform. You are not Catherine. You are one of the many women in her court, a lady-in-waiting perhaps, a noble by birth but powerless by role. Your days are long and your thoughts, never your own. The palace is cold in the mornings. The Winter Palace is not named by accident. Its walls are thick with stone, its windows always catching the gray of St. Petersburg's sky. The light comes in diffused, soft but never warm. The air smells of beeswax, ink and wool. You rise early. You dress carefully. Layer after layer, corset after corset. Your silhouette is not your choice, it's a political statement. Hair must be curled even if your fingers ache from the cold. Your face powdered even when you haven't slept. You smile on command. You lower your eyes just so. You remember the names of ambassadors' wives. You recall who favors which opera, and who must never be seated next to whom. Your survival depends not on truth, but on choreography. At court, everything is observed. The way you walk, the way you pause before entering a room. Whether you wear mourning for the right amount of weeks, not too little, not too long. The slightest misstep can exile you. Not formally, perhaps, but emotionally, socially. And that is often worse. Behind every fan hides a message. Behind every compliment, a weapon. You learn to listen without reacting. To speak without saying anything. To be seen without truly being known. Catherine is always present even when she is not in the room. She is an empress, powerful, brilliant, and terrifyingly aware. But she is also a mirror. To some, she reflects hope. To others, danger. She has favorites. She changes moods. She notices everything. And so, you watch her. You study her walk, her tone, her eyes. Because you must. Because in her presence, your future is decided, not by what you are, but how well you pretend. In the evening, you are exhausted, but cannot appear so. There are dinners, salons, discussions of philosophy you may not understand but must pretend to. You sip tea while calculating every word. You laugh at the correct volume. And when the candle is finally snuffed in your chamber, you do not sleep. You replay everything, every glance, every silence, every misstep. Tomorrow, you must do it all again. And still, somehow, find your dignity intact. This was the life for many women around Catherine. Dressed in silk, trapped in rules, given a voice only when it served someone else's purpose. It looked like elegance. It felt like pressure. And for some, it was unbearable. Gentle transition. But Catherine was not one of the many. She was the eye at the center of the storm. A woman born in a foreign land who would bend history to her will. Next we step into her mind, her story, her hunger, and the quiet, burning need to be more than a monarch, to be seen as a person. Catherine the Great, a woman who rewrote herself. She was not meant to be remembered. Not like this. Not as Catherine the Great, but as Sophia von Holtzerbst, a minor German princess, unremarkable by birth, chosen not for power, but for potential obedience. She arrived in Russia at 14. It was cold. The language was foreign. The court, sharp-edged and glacial. But even then she watched. She learned. And she began the lifelong task of rewriting herself, not through violence, not yet, but through silence, restraint, and relentless curiosity. The girl they thought they could mold was already writing her own script. She devoured books. Voltaire, Montesquieu, Plutarch, their voices became part of her. She copied entire volumes by hand just to feel the weight of their thoughts. At night, she wrote letters to herself. Some were reflections. Some were corrections. She studied everything: how to speak, how to disarm, how to make people feel seen without ever showing her own heart. And she waited. Her husband, the heir to the Russian throne, was a boy in a man's costume. Petty, cruel, bored by power and entranced by toys. She meanwhile was building alliances, whisper by whisper, gesture by gesture. By the time she took the throne in 1762, after a bloodless coup and his quiet death, the world barely blinked, because by then she was already empress in all but name. And yet, what did that power cost her? To rule in a man's world meant becoming something unnatural. Her femininity was always under scrutiny. Her lovers, always whispered about. Her mind, both admired and resented. She wrote plays and histories, essays and memoirs. But still they asked, who truly held the pen? She corresponded with philosophers across Europe. But still they wondered, was she sincere or simply playing her part? Catherine, always Catherine. Too ambitious, too sentimental, too powerful, too much. And still, she ruled. For 34 years. She expanded the empire, reformed its laws, modernized education, and imagined a country where thought might matter more than blood. But at night, when the halls of the palace were silent, when the last candle flickered in her writing chamber, did she ask herself, am I living right, if I no longer know who I am? Her public words remain, decrees, speeches, volumes of policy. But her private voice? That, perhaps, is what she guarded most fiercely, not out of fear, but out of self-preservation, because some truths are too delicate, some identities too tangled to expose. But sometimes the most powerful things are not what we find, but what we never recover. Next, we step beyond fact, into something softer, stranger, a diary that never surfaced, and a silence that speaks louder than any archive to history. The missing diary, what was lost or never meant to be found. You can't remember what you've never read, never heard, never held. And yet, we remember her. Not just the empress, not just the reformer, but the shadow behind the legend. Catherine's voice lingers, not in ink, but in absence. Not in pages, but in questions. There are rumors whispered softly in academic halls and echoed in the footsteps of archivists. That Catherine the Great kept a private diary, and that after her death, it vanished. No inventory mentions it. No heirs ever claimed it. No fires were officially reported in the archive. But something is missing. There are gaps in the timeline, echoes in her letters, moments where she refers to things we no longer have. It's apologies, reflections too vulnerable for public eyes. What if it existed? What if it was read and then hidden? What if she chose to let it go? Imagine a single leather-bound book, stored in a drawer she locked herself. Not policy, not diplomacy, but memory. What would it say? Would it speak of loneliness? Of love that hurt more than it healed? Would it record her regrets? The letters she didn't send, the lovers she trusted too much, the nights she stayed awake, wondering if anyone would ever know the real her? Some say it was burned by her successors. Too dangerous, too intimate, too revealing of a woman whose greatness lay not in her perfection, but in her conflict. Others say it never existed at all, that it was a story made up by those desperate to feel closer to her, by historians chasing ghosts, by readers hoping to hear her whisper just once from beyond time. But maybe it did exist, and maybe she destroyed it herself. Let them die with me, she might have thought. If my words become a cage, let them go. Not every story is meant to be told. Not every truth is meant for the public square. Sometimes privacy is the last kingdom a woman can rule. But what remains is not paper. It is a shadow. The shadow of a woman who stepped over pain, day after day, for power, for vision, for something more. A shadow you can still feel when you walk the stone corridors of St. Petersburg, when you brush your hand across an old letter, when you stand before her portrait and see the question in her eyes. Not what did I rule, but did I ever belong to myself? Soft transition. And even in that shadow there were others. Other women who lived in the margins. Courtiers, mistresses, enemies, ghosts. They too lived in silence. Next we turned toward them. Toward a court filled with secrets, where women held power without crowns, and left no memoirs at all. Power in silence. The world of empresses, mistresses, and ghosts. Not all power wears a crown. Some of it moves softly, in the rustle of silk behind a curtain, in the quiet tilt of a fan, in a letter never signed, a glance held too long. For every throne, there are dozens of women who stood beside it, or behind it, or just far enough away to be invisible. At Catherine's court, the silence was crowded. There were mistresses, official and unofficial, fierce, ambitious, intelligent women, whose names history turned into footnotes. They had no armies, no royal decrees, but they shaped outcomes, shifted alliances, whispered in the ears of ministers and monarchs alike. Some were given palaces, others were given exile. Take, for instance, Grigory Potemkin's niece, Countess Bernicka, charming, cultured, and carefully watched. Her affection for Catherine may never be confirmed, but she dined with her nightly. She walked beside her in gardens no one else could enter. And when the Empress fell ill, it was Bernicka who waited longest at her bedside. No declarations, no diaries, just presence. Or Anna Protasova, Catherine's trusted confidant. She had no title of her own, but she guarded the gates of the Empress's emotional world, choosing who came close, and who would be forgotten. She knew everything and said almost nothing. Her letters are brief, polite, carefully void of detail. And yet, when Catherine died, Anna wept like a sister. The court was full of these shadows. Women who curated silence like art, who carved small territories of influence through loyalty, charm, and intuition. They were never loud, never documented, but they were there, choosing fabrics for imperial gowns that made diplomatic statements, arranging seating charts that disguised punishments, delivering soft messages between rivals, or sometimes threats wrapped in perfume and pleasantry. Even Catherine herself played this game. Her relationships were not always grand romances. Some were strategic, some were comfort, some were the only place she could speak freely, if only for a season. But none of them truly saw her completely, because no one could. She belonged to the empire, to the image, to the myth. And so, she surrounded herself with women who understood how to protect the self, by never revealing it. They are gone now. Their portraits faded. Their letters filed away. Their names often confused with one another in books written centuries later. But they were real, and they mattered, not because they ruled, but because they endured, without being erased completely. And so we return to the silence, to the diary that may never have been, to the woman who reshaped an empire, to the ones who stood beside her, invisible but not forgotten. What remains is not a record, but a feeling, a shadow, still waiting in the corners of history. She speaks in shadows. She is gone. Her heart, her breath, her words, all scattered by time, like ash caught in wind. And yet, she speaks, not in proclamations, not in marble statues or gold-threaded portraits, but in shadows, in the questions she left behind, in the quiet ache of what was never said. We study her from a distance. We measure her reign in battles, borders, and reforms. We admire her mind, debate her choices, trace her footsteps in cold palaces and flickering candlelight. But the truth lives somewhere else. Somewhere between the letters she didn't send, and the pages no one ever found. Maybe she chose silence, not as defeat, but as defiance. Maybe she knew that even an empress cannot own her story, once it's written down. That to be remembered fully, sometimes means being misunderstood forever. Maybe she whispered to herself, I wanted my words to live, but if they become a cage, let them die with me. What remains is not a diary, not a document, not even certainty. What remains is memory, the kind passed through hands, through shadows, through longing. She lives in you. In every woman who wonders who she must become to be heard. In every soul who writes through the night just to stay whole. In every silent moment where strength is not shouted, but endured. And if you're listening, she still speaks. Not aloud, not loudly, but through a hush that lingers. After the candle has gone out, a voice that says, I was real. I was complicated. I was more than what they wrote. Imagine yourself waking. Not in a room, not in a bed, but inside a round, low tent. A gur, made of bent wooden slats and stretched felt, layered and stitched to hold back the cold. But the cold always finds a way in. Especially at dawn. The air inside the tent smells faintly of smoke, old wool, and the sour tang of fermented milk. You slept close to the fire, but the embers died sometime in the night, and now your breath fogs in the frigid morning air. You can hear the wind howling against the sides of the gur, a constant, lonely sound on the steppe. You don't have much time. The animals must be tended before the sun rises too far. You pull on thick, scratchy robes and leather boots lined with wool. Your hands are stiff, already red with cracks. You step outside. The wind cuts through you like a knife. The herd is restless. Yaks and sheep move in slow clumps, their breath steaming in the cold. You gather frozen dung, today's fuel for the fire. There are no trees here. No coal. You dry the dung in summer for winter use. It burns slowly with a bitter smell that clings to everything. You're not alone. Your family is busy, each person with tasks carved by repetition. One churns arag, fermented mare's milk, in a tall wooden vessel, the rhythm slow and steady. Another sharpens a worn knife. A child scours a cooking pot with coarse sand. There is no privacy. No solitude. Everything is shared, from meals to hardship. Your day is not broken into tasks or meetings or shifts, but a continuous loop of labor. Mending, herding, gathering, cleaning, boiling, packing, waiting. Sometimes the sky turns cruel. Snowstorms come with little warning. You tie ropes from the tent to the ground. You huddle. You hope. In summer, heat scorches the grasslands and the animals grow restless. Your survival depends entirely on their health. The herd fails, you starve. There is rarely enough water. It is fetched from distant wells or thin streams, carried in heavy leather sacks on the backs of animals or children. Bats are rare. Your skin is always dry. Your hair carries dust. You eat what you have: boiled meat, flat cakes, sour curds. Vegetables are strangers. Fruits are luxuries from distant markets. Still you chew slowly. It is fuel. You know better than to waste anything. You know hunger. You know windburn. You know the feeling of waking in the middle of the night to the sound of hooves, wondering if a predator or raider has come. You do not scream. You wait. You listen. And if it is nothing, you sleep again. Illness is a quiet terror. There are no doctors. Only herbal teas, rituals, and the wisdom of old women. Children die often. So do the elderly. You grow used to mourning in silence. You bury quickly. You don't mark the spot. And yet, you sing. Around the fire, someone hums a tune about spring grass. A child laughs at a bleeding goat. A neighbor shares a cup of hot broth, steaming and salty. In the silence between chores, you stare at the stars. They are endless. They blink with indifference. But they remind you that you belong to something vast. This is your life. You know every sound of it. Every bitter wind and every soft snowfall. You are a shadow on the steppe. A dot beneath the eternal blue sky. And when the sun sinks low and the herds are quiet, and the fire crackles with its slow, pungent burn, you sleep, wrapped in wool. The wind still howling as it always does. The death of Genghis Khan did not mark the end of Mongol power, it marked the beginning of a slow and complicated unraveling. You are no longer a herder. You are someone watching from the inside of a grand but fragile structure, an empire stitched together not by stone, but by kinship, loyalty, and fear. Genghis Khan died in 1227, and with his death came the question that would haunt his descendants for generations. Who would rule next? The Mongol tradition dictated that successors be chosen by Kurultai, a council of nobles. But tradition met ambition. And ambition, once awakened, does not sleep. The chosen heir was Ogdi, Genghis Khan's third son. Not the eldest, not the most ruthless, but the one the great Khan believed could hold the center. And for a while Ogdi did. He expanded the empire westward, conquering Russian principalities and pressing into Europe. But Ogdi drank too much, laughed too hard, delegated too often. In 1241 he died, and the real succession crisis began. There was no plan. Only blood, titles, and uneasy silence. In the void, a woman stepped forward. Her name was Torajin Khatun, Ogdi's widow. She ruled as regent, not in name but in deed. For 5 years she delayed the selection of a new Khan, working tirelessly to place her own son, Gayuk, on the throne. She wrote letters to faraway rulers. She built alliances through marriage and flattery. She dismissed rivals. She ruled behind a veil, but everyone saw the power she held. When Gayuk finally ascended in 1246, the empire groaned. His rule was brief and bitter. He alienated key family lines, particularly the house of Talyui, another of Genghis's sons. Gayuk died mysteriously just 2 years later during a military campaign. Some whispered poison, others exhaustion. But no one truly knew. The empire was now fragmented. Not in territory but in trust. Each branch of Genghis Khan's lineage had its own ambitions, its own armies, its own vision for the future. And so, in 1251, another Kurultai was called. This time, not all nobles attended. Some boycotted. Others plotted. The assembly elected Monk Khan, a grandson of Talyui. His selection was supported by the most influential figure of the time, his brother, Hulagu. And behind the scenes, another brother waited, Kublai, quiet, observant, patient. Monk's reign was one of order, but also of quiet paranoia. He knew he ruled an empire full of uncles and cousins with grievances. He sent spies. He demanded oaths. He launched purges. Rivals, including many from Ogdi's line, were accused of conspiracy. Some were executed. Others disappeared. Entire family lines were reduced to whispers. Imagine that world. A world where your life depended not on loyalty but on timing. Where one missed tribute, one ill-phrased letter, one wrong marriage alliance could mean exile. Or worse. Monk ruled from Karakoram, the capital city of jars and temples, where Turkish artisans and Chinese scribes rubbed shoulders in smoky courtrooms. He emphasized administration, taxes, infrastructure. But beneath it all, the memory of Genghis lingered, not just as legend but as expectation. What followed after Monk's death in 1259 was civil war. Kublai and Erik Bok, both grandsons of Genghis, fought for the Khanate. The empire splintered again. 4 Khanates emerged, each claiming legitimacy, each drifting further from the center. The once united horde had become an uneasy federation. It's easy to forget that behind every sweeping conquest map was a room full of men with grudges, and women with strategies, and generals with uncertain loyalties. The succession crisis was not a single moment, but a long unraveling, like threads slowly pulled from a tightly woven tapestry. What held the Mongol Empire together wasn't walls or coin, but the memory of one man's will. And when that memory grew faint, the wind returned to claim its own. In the end, the empire didn't collapse from invasion. It fractured from within, family against family, branch against branch. And yet, for decades after, the name of Genghis Khan still echoed in courtrooms and councils. Not because he ruled, but because no one else ever truly could. The steps remember. So do the bloodlines. And somewhere, far from the palace, a herdsman still ties rope against the wind, never knowing who sits the throne. Now let us step away from the campfires of politics and the cold routines of daily labor, and turn our gaze toward the sky. For the Mongols, the world was not divided into heavens and hells, temples and scriptures. Their cosmos was simpler and stranger. It was wind and fire, ancestor and sky, spirit and silence. It was Tingri, the eternal blue heaven, above all. There were no grand tombs like the Egyptians, no burning pyres like the Hindus, no catacombs or pyramids. Instead, when a Mongol died, especially one of honor, they were returned, not to the ground, but to the air. Sky burial. A ritual both sacred and deeply pragmatic. The body was carried far from the encampment, often to a quiet hilltop or open steppe. There, in solemn silence, it was left exposed to the elements. Left for the birds, the wolves, the wind. To a modern ear, this might sound harsh. But to the Mongols, it was an act of humility. The soul did not need the body. And the body, now empty, could feed the great wheel of life, just as the animals had once fed the person who now fed them in return. Imagine the hush of it. A cold morning. A few family members standing in the grass. No tombstone. No coffin. Just the sky, vast and unblinking. There were no priests. But there were shamans, Bo or Udgin, men and women who communed with the spirit world. They did not preach. They listened. Sometimes they drummed. Sometimes they chanted. Sometimes they sat in silence, head bowed, waiting for visions to rise like mist. The shaman might interpret dreams, guide the dead to their ancestors, or intervene when sickness struck the herd. They wore cloaks of animal hide, antlers, bones, feathers, symbols of the in-between. To the Mongols, these spirit talkers were bridges. Not holy, not divine, just necessary. Tingri was not a god in the human sense. It was sky, living, watching, enduring. It saw all. It judged little. Its approval was felt in the weather, in the success of a hunt, in the fortune of childbirth. Offerings were made in its name. A splash of milk tossed to the wind, a tuft of horsehair tied to a sacred tree, a whispered word before setting out on a journey. There were no temples, but there were ovu, sacred stone cairns piled high by passers-by. When a traveler approached one, they would circle it 3 times clockwise, adding a stone or branch to the mound, whispering prayers for protection. These were waypoints for the soul, resting places for invisible travelers. Children were taught to respect the spirits of the land. A river had memory. A mountain could become angry. Fire was never mocked. Stones were not needlessly disturbed. Even a strange breeze might be the passing of a spirit, to be greeted, not feared. We know much of this not through monuments but through echoes. Through the journals of foreign envoys, through Chinese records, through the oral histories passed down in quiet jars. Through the archaeology of bone fragments carefully placed, or of burial sites hidden by design. For the most honored dead were buried in secret, often under the cover of night, their graves marked only by absence. One legend says that Genghis Khan himself was buried in an unmarked grave, his funeral procession killing every witness along the route, before being swallowed by the steppe. Whether this is true or not, it reflects the Mongol belief that death is not performance. It is return. The earth reclaims. The sky watches. There is no fear in this worldview. Only balance. You take. You give. You live. You are lived through. The hawk that eats your flesh today may fly beside your grandchild tomorrow. So when the wind stirs a feather on the ground, or when a sudden silence settles over the plain, a Mongol might nod slightly and whisper a name, not in grief, but in recognition, because to be remembered was not to be mourned. It was to be folded back into the song of the land. The steppe does not forget, and the sky sees everything. Let us now leave behind the wind-burned herders, the whispering shamans, and the sky-scoured burial grounds. We step now into the world of command, not carved in stone but stitched in silk and strategy. You are no longer among the common folk. You are approaching the golden tent, the ordo, the mobile court of Genghis Khan. It is not a palace in the way you might imagine. There are no marble halls or sweeping staircases. It is still a tent, circular, low to the ground, built to move with the seasons. But its size dwarfs all others. Its felt walls are bleached white and embroidered in gold thread. The poles inside are lacquered wood. Incense burns softly. Silks from China hang like banners. Persian carpets soften the dust beneath your feet. Outside, guards stand in quiet formation, not with gleaming armor but in plain leather and fur, with bows slung at their backs and eyes that miss nothing. Inside, the air is hushed but alive. You hear the slow rustle of scrolls being unrolled, the quiet clink of goblets, the murmuring of translators, Persian, Uyghur, Chinese, Russian, Arabic. This is not just a seat of power. It is a crossroads of the world. Genghis Khan sits not on a throne, but on a raised platform, wrapped in a robe that is not ostentatious but precise. Every stitch, every ornament communicates function and authority. Around him, his council, composed of generals, sons, and advisors, speak in calm voices, carefully weighed words. There is no room for flattery here. Only competence. Only loyalty. Daily life in the court is a performance of control. Meals are formal. Simple meat and broth, but served with ritual. Before each meal, a drop of kumis, fermented mare's milk, is sprinkled to the ground for the spirits. Hands are washed in silence. No one eats before the Khan. Meetings begin at dawn and stretch into dusk. Topics range from tax collection in Bokhara to the health of the steppe herds. A map lies unrolled at the center of the room, not a decorative piece but a living document. Lines shift. Borders bend. Names are crossed out. Replaced. Scribes sit cross-legged in the corners, recording every word in multiple scripts. The Mongols, though largely illiterate themselves, understood the value of written memory. Edicts were issued in several languages. Messengers were trained to ride fast and forget nothing. Education in the elite family was practical. Sons were taught not just to fight but to command, to read people, to listen before speaking. Daughters, too, played a critical role, often married strategically to bind rival clans, or appointed to govern regions in the Khan's name. The women of the court, mothers, wives, sisters, were not ornaments. They managed logistics, advised on alliances. Some, like Borte, Genghis's wife, held considerable power in his absence. Others led entire ordos of their own, issuing orders beneath their own tents, their own banners flying. Luxury existed, but it was never excessive. Gold was not hoarded, but circulated. Silk was worn not to dazzle, but to signify command. The Khan slept on furs, but he also rose before most. Discipline was admired more than indulgence. Still, there were moments of softness. The playing of the Morin Kur, the horsehead fiddle, at twilight, its long, slow notes rising like breath. Children playing with carved bone toys in the corners of the court. A visiting poet reciting verses from the Persian classics. A falcon returning from a silent hunt, feathers ruffled, proud. Foreign envoys came often, from Baghdad, from Rome, from the Song court in China. They brought tribute and questions. They were treated with courtesy but not awe. For in the Mongol world, power was not claimed by birthright alone. It had to be proven, again and again. The golden tent was never meant to last forever. It moved with the Khan. It collapsed and was rebuilt. Like the empire itself, it was vast but fragile. Controlled but never fully settled. To live inside it was to live in a place of strange calm, where silence had meaning, where decisions could reshape continents, and where trust was both rare and absolute. And when night fell, the candlelight flickered softly across scrolls and armor, and the wind, always the wind, brushed against the tent walls, reminding even the most powerful that the step was never far away. There are moments when I remember that death doesn't always knock. It just arrives, quiet as the first light before morning. And what it leaves behind isn't noise. It's something worse. A stillness so heavy I swear I can hear it breathing through the walls. But I wonder, what if it's not just silence? What if something lingers? Not a ghost exactly, but a memory sealed in the floorboards. A warning maybe, one we were never meant to hear. But what if it's not just silence? What if something remains, sealed inside the rooms like a memory or a warning? Deep in the southern countryside of England, nestled between mist-drenched fields and falling leaves, stands a forgotten Victorian estate. Its facade is cracked with time, its windows shrouded in webs. Locals call it the Talbot House, named after the man who once lived there. But long before the paint peeled and the wood rotted, this house held a secret. Sir Thomas Talbot, scholar, alchemist, a man obsessed not with life, but with the moment it ends. He spent his days studying what he called the final threshold. He wanted to measure it, record it, capture it. In one of the house's upper rooms, behind a tall bookshelf, was a hidden workshop. Dusty now, silent, but once alive with motion and calculation. There, upon a heavy oak table, lay Talbot's last creation, a set of handcrafted clocks. Not just timekeepers, instruments. Each fitted with a silver pendulum, polished to reflect the dim candlelight. And on each clock's face, etched words in Latin, tempus mortis, the time of death. He didn't build them to count hours. He built them to wait, to listen. Talbot believed that if a machine could be precise enough, if it could be tuned not to seconds but to the very breath of life, it might catch the instant when the soul leaves the body. He kept journals full of notes, changes in rhythm, shifts in temperature, dreams. He would walk the room, staring at the pendulum swing as if reading a pulse. He whispered, "Time, it's beginning to slow." Servants said he became distant, restless. They heard him talking to himself in the dark, heard the ticking stop and restart with no reason. One maid claimed the pendulum shimmered without light. In the autumn of 1890, Talbot ordered the windows sealed. No more light, he said. No more sound. He wanted the house to breathe in darkness, to hold its breath. And within that breath, he waited. The first time the clocks all stopped, no one paid attention. A mistake. Someone forgot to wind them. But when Talbot was found slumped in his chair, ink still fresh on the page before him, and the clock on the wall read 4:13, and would not move again, they knew. Something had ended. His clocks never ticked again. Not truly. Not for time. The workshop stands untouched. Dust has gathered. Ink has dried. And the clock still stands, as if waiting for something. Or someone. The final experiment. In the final week of October 1883, something shifted in the house on the hill. The air felt heavier, as if it carried the charge of a storm that would never break. The servants exchanged uneasy glances and avoided stepping near the laboratory. The light inside never seemed to dim, and from behind the closed door came the scratching of a pen, the occasional cough and quiet, whispered Latin, words not meant to be heard. Sir Thomas Talbot had stopped joining meals. He barely ate. He no longer slept. He spoke cryptically of how time was thickening, how it no longer flows but curls inward. For the last 3 days, he had written endlessly into a small black journal he kept close to his chest. No one had seen its contents. On the 4th night, he left instructions. No one was to enter his study until dawn, no matter what. And they obeyed, not out of duty but out of fear. There was something in his eyes that warned them. A quiet, almost desperate insistence that this final solitude was vital. At first light, as the mist began to peel away from the grass, his manservant Garrett finally unlocked the door. He knew what he would find. Somehow they all did. Inside there was no sign of distress. The air was cold. On the desk, a silver-tipped pen resting in ink. Sir Talbot sat in his high-backed chair near the window, cloaked in his velvet robe, eyes partially shut, as if he had fallen asleep in mid-thought. On his face, a strange stillness. Not pain but the pale hush of relief. Maybe even a victory. But it was not the stillness that struck Garrett cold. It was the clock. Mounted just above Sir Talbot's head, the very one he had built by hand, its pendulum crafted from pure silver, the words Tempus Mortis etched into the face, had stopped. The hands were frozen. At precisely 4:13. Garrett assumed it had simply wound down or the mechanism had failed. But later that morning when the coroner arrived, he confirmed the exact time of death through every method available. Temperature, rigor, posture. 4:13 a.m. Coincidence? Maybe. But the clockwork was intact. The mainspring full. The pendulum unbroken. No draft. No tremor. No explanation for why a perfectly functioning timepiece would stop the moment its maker drew his final breath. In Sir Talbot's hand was the black journal. Closed. Sealed with a copper clasp. The key was never found. And the ink on the last page was still wet. A coincidence or a sign? The rumors began even before the funeral. The servants said that the clock in Talbot's study, the one with the engraving Tempus Mortis, stopped at the exact same minute as its owner's heart. At 4:13 a.m. Not earlier. Not later. That precise moment, and never again. When the coroner arrived, he was reserved about the story. His job was to determine time of death, not to chase superstition. But the results were perfectly clear. Body temperature. Pupil response. Muscles. 4:13 a.m. Exactly like the hands frozen on the clock. At first, they thought it was a coincidence. The house was old, there could have been a draft. The mechanism, perhaps faulty. But when a clockmaker was called to examine it, he shook his head. The spring was intact, the pendulum untouched. The winding was full. The clock was fully functional. No one touched it? No, sir. We didn't dare enter until dawn, just as he instructed. Of course, you could write it off as chance. Even the strangest things sometimes have simple explanations. But in Talbot's case, there was too much precision. He was obsessed with the moment of death. He wrote essays, debated scholars, drew strange diagrams. He believed that death wasn't a process, but a singular moment that could be caught. That the soul, leaving the body, leaves behind a trace. And that trace could be measured. His clock, he claimed, would be the tool. The true instrument of departure. He forged the pendulum from silver. Carved the engraving with his own hands. And the mechanism, intricate as a miniature universe, was designed according to the principles of both alchemy and physics. And all of it, for 1 minute. Now the question wasn't just why the clock had stopped, but why this clock? There were clocks all over the house. Wall clocks, pocket watches, mantle clocks. None of them stopped. Only this one. Only the one Talbot had made. Only the one that bore the words Tempus Mortis, the time of death. Maybe he succeeded. Maybe he didn't just catch his final breath, but sent it to a place where time still listens. Some would later claim, Talbot summoned something he didn't understand. That his experiments disturbed not just science, but the very fabric of the line between life and what comes after. Or maybe it was simply a scientist's obsession. A coincidence. An old clock. But if so, why did people still get chills when stepping into that study even years later? Why did those who stood beneath the clock say they felt a pressure in the air, as if time there was denser? Why, in the museum where the mechanism now rests behind glass, do staff still avoid walking past it at night? Coincidence? Or something else entirely? When Talbot's house was sealed, it seemed the story had ended. The scholar was dead. The clock had stopped. The journal was locked away. But time is stubborn. It doesn't always let stories die quietly. The manor stood empty for almost 2 years. No buyer came forward. Some said it was the damp. Others blamed the rumors. But the servants whispered. Someone still walked the halls at night. As if the creaking of the floorboards wasn't settling wood, but footsteps. In 1885, a gentleman from London, Mr. Arthur Kemble, a professor, finally purchased the estate. He scoffed at the tales, called them charming folklore. He moved in with his wife and 2 children. The first week passed peacefully, but on the 8th day something changed. Mrs. Kemble swore she heard ticking at night, but none of the house's clocks had been wound yet. She dismissed it as imagination, until she found, behind a draped canvas in the study, the clock still hanging on the wall. Tempus mortis. It didn't move, but she would later insist the hands twitched the moment she entered the room. Weeks passed. The children began waking from dreams saying the same thing. Daddy, the man with the clock, was in the hallway again. At first they laughed, then they didn't. Especially when they realized that every single night, precisely at 4:13 a.m., the lights in the house dimmed. For just 1 second. All at once. Mr. Kemble decided to take the clock down. He called a locksmith. But as the man touched the frame, the pendulum swung, on its own. And something fell out of the casing. A thin copper plate, etched with symbols. To this day, no one has translated them. The family left soon after. Quietly. No announcement. Just gone. The house fell into silence once more. The clock was later donated to a museum in Warwickshire. It hangs in a separate room now, behind glass with no description. But museum staff report strange things. Near dawn, the pendulum sometimes shifts. The surveillance feed, filming the room 24/7, flickers at exactly 4:13. For a brief second, like someone is standing in front of the glass. Once, a tour guide joked, "That's just Thomas checking if time still moves without him." She quit the next day. Now no one touches the clock. No one cleans near it. And the display glass? It fogs up from the inside. They say it's humidity, but no one explains why. Every time, the fog leaves the same faint smudge, right where a face might be, as if someone is still watching. At the legend, some say it was a pact. That Sir Thomas Talbot, learned man of reason and scholar of the unseen, crossed a line that should have remained untouched. That his obsession with measuring the exact moment of death wasn't scientific curiosity, but a desire to peer into the veil itself. And that, in those final days, he succeeded. They say the clock didn't stop on its own. It was called. Summoned by a force Talbot had spent a lifetime chasing. The very force that governs the boundary between life and what comes after. The words engraved beneath its face, Tempus Mortis, weren't just poetic. They were a warning, a prophecy, or perhaps a key. Those who believe in such things point to the precision, the silence that followed. The way no dust settled on the clock for days, though the rest of the room lay untouched, as if something had passed through, unseen but real. Others scoff. They say it was coincidence, a quirk of old metal and gears and nothing more. That Talbot story is simply that, a story inflated by time and shadow. But the rumors, they remain. It's said that the clock was later donated to a small regional museum in Wiltshire, and that it still rests there, behind glass, forever frozen at 4:13. Staff whisper that from time to time, visitors feel faint when they approach it. That one nurse, visiting on holiday, collapsed when standing near it, and later claimed to have seen Talbot's reflection in the glass. A superstition? Probably. And yet, more than a century after his death, the legend of Talbot's clock has become more than a footnote in dusty archives. It's told quietly in university halls. It's shared in ghost tours, whispered over candlelight in foggy inns. It doesn't always let stories die quietly. The manor stood empty for almost 2 years. No buyer came forward. Some said it was the damp. Others blamed the rumors. But the servants whispered. Someone still walked the halls at night. As if the creaking of the floorboards wasn't settling wood, but footsteps. In 1885, a gentleman from London, Mr. Arthur Kemble, a professor, finally purchased the estate. He scoffed at the tales, called them charming folklore. He moved in with his wife and 2 children. The first week passed peacefully, but on the 8th day something changed. Mrs. Kemble swore she heard ticking at night, but none of the house's clocks had been wound yet. She dismissed it as imagination, until she found, behind a draped canvas in the study, the clock still hanging on the wall. Tempus mortis. It didn't move, but she would later insist the hands twitched the moment she entered the room. Weeks passed. The children began waking from dreams saying the same thing. "Daddy, the man with the clock was in the hallway again." At first they laughed. Then they didn't. Especially when they realized that every single night, precisely at 4:13 a.m., the lights in the house dimmed. For just 1 second. All at once. Mr. Kemble decided to take the clock down. He called a locksmith. But as the man touched the frame, the pendulum swung, on its own. And something fell out of the casing. A thin copper plate, etched with symbols. To this day, no one has translated them. The family left soon after. Quietly. No announcement. Just gone. The house fell into silence once more. The clock was later donated to a museum in Warwickshire. It hangs in a separate room now, behind glass with no description. But museum staff report strange things. Near dawn, the pendulum sometimes shifts. The surveillance feed, filming the room 24/7, flickers at exactly 4:13. For a brief second, like someone is standing in front of the glass. Once a tour guide joked, "That's just Thomas checking if time still moves without him." She quit the next day. Now no one touches the clock. No one cleans near it. And the display glass? It fogs up from the inside. They say it's humidity, but no one explains why. Every time, the fog leaves the same faint smudge, right where a face might be, as if someone is still watching. At the legend, some say it was a pact. That Sir Thomas Talbot, learned man of reason and scholar of the unseen, crossed a line that should have remained untouched. That his obsession with measuring the exact moment of death wasn't scientific curiosity, but a desire to peer into the veil itself. And that, in those final days, he succeeded. They say the clock didn't stop on its own. It was called. Summoned by a force Talbot had spent a lifetime chasing. The very force that governs the boundary between life and what comes after. The words engraved beneath its face, Tempus Mortis, weren't just poetic. They were a warning, a prophecy, or perhaps a key. Those who believe in such things point to the precision, the silence that followed. The way no dust settled on the clock for days, though the rest of the room lay untouched, as if something had passed through, unseen but real. Others scoff. They say it was coincidence, a quirk of old metal and gears and nothing more. That Talbot story is simply that, a story inflated by time and shadow. But the rumors, they remain. It's said that the clock was later donated to a small regional museum in Wiltshire, and that it still rests there, behind glass, forever frozen at 4:13. Staff whisper that from time to time, visitors feel faint when they approach it. That one nurse, visiting on holiday, collapsed when standing near it, and later claimed to have seen Talbot's reflection in the glass. A superstition? Probably. And yet, more than a century after his death, the legend of Talbot's clock has become more than a footnote in dusty archives. It's told quietly in university halls. It's shared in ghost tours, whispered over candlelight in foggy inns. The shutters rattle. The wind groans low along the eaves of the house like something ancient and unsatisfied. Outside, the trees lean too far in one direction as if they're listening. Inside, the fire is nearly out. You set down the book, but the quiet doesn't comfort you. The silence feels like breath held too long. You want to believe it's just a story, but it isn't. Not really. This is Salem. And Salem remembers. In the year 1692, winter came like a punishment. It sank its teeth into the wooden bones of the town, cracking walls, freezing wells, and chilling hearts already steeped in dread. Salem village was no place for comfort. It was a place where light flickered but never truly burned, where the world ended at the treeline, and the dark beyond it belonged to something unspeakable. A small Puritan settlement in colonial Massachusetts, Salem was a place where fear had been baptized. Nothing in life was random. Misfortune meant judgment. A stillbirth. A spoiled harvest. A cow that wouldn't give milk. These were never coincidences. They were warnings. Someone somewhere had sinned, and someone would have to pay. Behind each window was a candle and a question. The candle for God. The question for your neighbor, or your wife, or your child. Religion ruled with an iron whisper. God, omnipresent and all-seeing, demanded purity. But the devil was closer. He could be in a gaze that lingered too long, in a question that felt too bold, in the way someone walked home at night without lighting a lantern. Men led, women obeyed, children watched, and remembered, and feared. The Puritans did not see evil as some distant, foreign enemy. It was not out there. It was here, among them. It was a living thing with a name that changed depending on who was watching. The winter of 1691 to 1692 dragged on with a particular cruelty. The days were short and gray. The nights were long and full of the kind of silence that makes you hear too much. Creaking wood, muttering prayers, a cough behind the wall. And the whispering. Always the whispering. And then the girls began to scream. In the parsonage of Reverend Samuel Parris, two young girls, his daughter Betty, age 9, and his orphan niece Abigail Williams, age 11, began to twist and shout, eyes wide, mouths locked open in silent agony. They collapsed, they trembled, they wailed that unseen hands scratched their skin and pulled their hair. Their bodies jerked in rhythms no hymn could match. Their words were chaos. Reverend Parris didn't question. He knew what this was. In Salem there was no room for mystery, only evil, exposed or hidden. And if it was hidden, it had to be rooted out. If the devil had crept into his home, it meant war. A doctor was called. His diagnosis? The girls were under an evil hand. The devil had come to Salem. And he had come through someone. A witch. The search began not with proof, but with difference. 3 women were named. Not because they were caught brewing potions or dancing naked in the woods. No. They were chosen because they were easy to blame. Tituba, a Caribbean slave in the Paris household, known for telling stories full of strange spirits and unfamiliar gods. She was dark-skinned, foreign and poor. Sarah Good, a beggar who wandered from door to door, muttering to herself, angry at the world that had given her nothing. Sarah Osborne, a woman who had defied convention, married beneath her, neglected church, lived on the outskirts of society's expectations. 3 women. None of them safe. None of them proper. None of them likely to be defended. They were dragged into court, questioned under threat and pressure. And then, Tituba confessed. Whether out of fear, coercion, or the desperate instinct to survive, she said the words that would burn through Salem like wildfire. Yes, the devil had come to her. In the shape of a black dog. He had spoken to her. And yes, there were others. Many others. Hiding in plain sight. She saw them. Named none. But left the door wide open. Her confession didn't end the nightmare. It began it. Because now the town didn't just fear the devil. They feared each other. And a whisper was all it took to be next. This wasn't a trial. It wasn't an investigation. It was the sound of fire catching dry wood. It was a hunt. A witch hunt. No one can say exactly where fear ends and madness begins. There's no clear moment. No audible snap. The line that separates the two isn't thick or straight or marked in red. It's barely there at all. Sometimes it's as thin as a spider's thread stretched across the doorway of a dark room. And sometimes it simply disappears. In Salem, during the cold, cracking winter of 1692, that line vanished entirely. And in its place, a single word remained, one whispered in corners and shouted in courtrooms, one that gripped the town by the throat. Witch. Everything changed after Tituba's confession. It was as if the very air shifted. The streets felt colder. The church pews harder. Fear no longer lingered, it moved. It spread like breath on glass, coating everything. People began to look at one another differently. Every glance carried a second meaning. Every gesture invited suspicion. A cough during a sermon, a murmur in your sleep, a skirt too long or too short, eyes that stayed open during prayer or closed too long during dinner. Anything could be misread, reframed, weaponized. The town grew tense. You could feel it in the silence between conversations, in the way neighbors no longer lingered at each other's fences, in how tightly mothers gripped their children's hands when walking past the homes of the accused. Superstition saturated every inch of daily life. People began to see signs in the shape of smoke rising from chimneys. They traced warnings in the grain of wooden floors, in the patterns left by melted snow. What was once just bad luck, sour milk, a stillborn calf, a sleepless night, was now read as evidence. Proof that someone nearby was working in darkness. But fear on its own is not enough to ignite hysteria. Hysteria needs kindling. And in Salem, that kindling came from the mouths of children. It began with the girls who had first fallen ill, or so it seemed. Betty Parris, the minister's young daughter. Abigail Williams, his niece. And Putnam, Mercy Lewis, and others. They were all girls, some not yet 10 years old, others barely into womanhood. In their small hands, the town's fate began to tremble. What began as strange fits, screaming, convulsing, crying out at shadows, quickly became something else. They didn't just suffer anymore. They started to accuse. Perhaps at first, it was just a way to avoid punishment. They had gathered secretly in kitchens and cellars, lit by flickering candles, listening to Tituba's forbidden stories, tales of spirits and omens, of beasts and spells. In a world of strict rules and quiet rooms, Those stories must have felt intoxicating. But once discovered, fear of retribution overtook them. And so, cornered and trembling, they pointed fingers. They said they had been bewitched, that someone had cursed them, that they were not to blame for their screaming or their visions. Someone else was. And when the adults listened, really listened, the girls learned something. Being believed held power. Abigail Williams was especially convincing. Her performances grew elaborate, eyes rolled back, voice hoarse with terror, body trembling as though seized by unseen hands. She cried out the names of those who had visited her in spirit, whose ghosts whispered to her in the night. People believed her. How could they not? She was young. She was innocent. And more than anything, she was persuasive. Other girls followed her lead. Soon the courtroom was filled with a chorus of voices, each one trembling, pointing, crying. They spoke of specters and shapes, of devils appearing in dreams and invisible claws that scratched their skin. These claims became what the court called spectral evidence. It didn't matter if the accused had never left their bed. If a girl said she saw your spirit, it was enough. At first, they targeted the obvious, outcasts, those already mistrusted. The poor, the odd, the ones who kept to themselves. But it didn't stop there. Eventually, they accused respected women. Wives, mothers, midwives, elders, teachers. The line blurred. The web widened. And then, no one was safe. The town trembled. But by the time anyone questioned what was happening, it was too late. The accusations came faster than reason could hold them back. To doubt the girls was to risk being named. To stay silent was safer. Or perhaps not safe at all. And so began the most infamous witch hunt in history. Not with broomsticks. Not with cauldrons or pointed hats. But with white bonnets, laced bodices, and prayers spoken through clenched teeth. With voices that quivered, not from guilt, but from the terrifying power of being heard. Sometimes truth isn't necessary. Not when fear is in the room. Fear is louder than reason. It swells in the silence between questions, grows in the cracks of doubt, and settles behind the eyes of the most rational men. And once fear is allowed to speak, facts no longer matter. Evidence is no longer required. When fear becomes the judge, no one is truly innocent. By the spring of 1692, the Salem courthouse had become a stage. The seats were filled not with lawyers or philosophers, but with neighbors, people who knew one another, who had once prayed together, traded with each other, shared fences and sorrows. They came not for truth, but for confirmation. They didn't want to learn, they wanted to watch. The building never seemed to sleep. The trials ran day after day. The air inside was always thick, with candle smoke, the smell of damp wool, and something else, something harder to name. A stillness that settled over the room just before the screams began. A weight that pressed down on even the most devout shoulders. They called them witch trials. But in reality, they were little more than ceremonies of fear. There were no witnesses in the traditional sense. No physical evidence. No written confessions, no concrete proof. Instead, the court placed its trust in something called spectral evidence. The claim that the spirit of an accused person had appeared to someone in a dream or a vision, or in the space between waking and sleeping. If a girl stood up and said, "Her spirit choked me in the night," the court took it as truth. There was no need to ask where or when or how. The dream itself became the crime. The nightmare became the noose. The same girls who had first cried out in Reverend Parris's house were now the stars of the courtroom. They were led in like saints, swaddled in blankets, eyes wide with warning. The moment they saw the accused, they would fall to the floor, trembling, shrieking, clawing at their own skin. They shouted that invisible hands were grabbing them, burning them, cutting them. And the people believed it. During the trial of Sarah Good, one of the girls suddenly shrieked, "She's looking at me. She's scratching me from the inside." Her body convulsed. She pointed to her chest, where there was no wound. But the judges leaned forward. They nodded solemnly. It was enough. The magistrates were not fools. They were educated men, some of the most literate in the colonies. But their logic had a loophole. They believed that Satan was clever. He would not leave behind fingerprints or bruises. He would work through spirit, illusion, disguise. And so, the more invisible the evil, the more convincing it seemed. This belief made defense almost impossible. How does one disprove a dream? How do you demonstrate that your soul stayed inside your body while someone else slept? You couldn't. You could only beg, cry, swear innocence. But the louder you swore it, the more your desperation was seen as defiance. If you wept too much, you were guilty. If you didn't weep at all, you were cold. If you prayed, you were mocking God. If you stayed silent, your silence was damning. Another form of evidence came from the body itself. The accused were examined for what they called a witch's mark, a mole, a scar, an oddly shaped freckle. If a dog sniffed it, licked it, or even glanced at it, it was said that the devil was feeding through that spot. Absurd, yes. But Salem had long since left reason behind. In Salem, absurdity was gospel. Sometimes the entire case rested on a single phrase. I felt cold when she entered the room. My chest tightened when she walked past. The bread wouldn't rise after she touched the flour. It was never about what a person had done. It was about what others felt around them. The court listened to sensations. And every emotion was a potential execution. The courtroom was a trap. A puzzle box with no exit. Once inside, you either confessed, often falsely, or you resisted. And resistance meant death. And still, the most unsettling part of it all wasn't the accusations or the screaming or even the hangings. It was the stillness in the room when the verdicts were read. The way people nodded. The way they whispered prayers with relief that it wasn't them. The way belief took root so deeply, it made doubt feel dangerous. They believed that evil could look like a woman they'd known since childhood. That it could wear a neighbor's shawl. That it could bake bread, sing hymns, smile on Sunday, and still serve darkness. They believed that truth was whatever frightened them the most. And maybe, in that moment, they were right. The Salem witch trials were not the invention of a single madman. No unhinged tyrant stood alone at the pulpit, stirring chaos with wild eyes. No, this was something far more terrifying. It was coordinated, composed. A chorus of nightmare, where each voice, each robe, each nod of agreement played its part in the rising tide. Justice, or what passed for it, took the form of ritual. Not with incense or bells, but with ink, silence, and hanging ropes. Salem became a kind of stage, narrow, cold, lit not by footlights but by candle smoke and dread. And on that stage stood men who had been taught all their lives that righteousness did not whisper. It condemned. At the center of it all was William Stoughton, a man whose name still echoes through the yellowed pages of Massachusetts history. He was not flamboyant. He didn't rage or foam or curse. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. His eyes were sharp and hollow, the kind that had long ago decided what was true. He didn't judge with law. He judged with certainty. To Stoughton, guilt wasn't a verdict. It was a default. Every accused woman or man who stood before him was already suspect by nature of being named. If they confessed, they were guilty. If they denied it, well, guilt speaks in denial too, does it not? Beside him sat other judges and ministers. They were educated men, trained in scripture and letters, some of them graduates of Harvard, men who had spent more years reading Bibles than planting crops. Their names, once admired in sermons and court documents, now lie carved into stone, etched into old cemeteries where moss grows thick over judgment. But in 1692, these men were not yet memories. They were real, and they believed, not in nuance, not in error, but in battle. To them, Salem wasn't just a town, it was a battlefield for the soul of New England, and they were the soldiers of God. Their general, though never officially seated in the courtroom, was Reverend Cotton Mather, a towering figure in the Puritan world. Mather was not a madman either. He was brilliant, eloquent, respected, and deeply afraid of what he believed lurked beneath the surface of colonial life. In his sermons, evil wasn't an idea, it was a living force, moving in shadows, slipping into homes, corrupting women, whispering to children. He believed in demons, in spiritual warfare, in the divine necessity of purification. It was Mather who wrote, "Better to execute 10 witches than to let one guilty soul go free." That phrase became the heartbeat of the trials. A mantra, a weapon disguised as wisdom. None of these men thought themselves evil. That was the most frightening part. They thought they were doing good, protecting the weak, honoring God, defending truth. And it is always most dangerous when cruelty wears the mask of righteousness. When a new woman was dragged before the bench, the same script unfolded. William Stoughton would lean forward, not to inquire, but to wait. "Have you served the devil?" A simple question with no safe answer. If she replied no, she was resisting the light. If she wept, she was hiding her guilt behind emotion. And if she said nothing, silence was seen as the devil's favorite disguise. Some broke under the pressure. Who wouldn't? They confessed to sins they never committed. They invented stories, midnight pacts, flying dreams, dark ceremonies they had never imagined until the court demanded it. And then, paradoxically, they were spared. For now. That was the logic. If you confessed to consorting with the devil, you might live. But if you held to the truth, you would die. The court had twisted itself into a ritual of inverse morality. Innocence led to execution. Lies bought survival. The executioners wore no hoods. There were no dark forests, no flaming torches, no secret meetings at crossroads. Only benches, parchment, and seals. Their tools were ink and quill. Their sentences whispered like prayers, softly, calmly, without remorse. Each name written on a death warrant was followed by a signature, a hand that did not tremble, a belief that what they were doing was necessary, holy even. And so, Salem became a theater where good and evil changed costumes, where saints resembled sinners. And the most terrifying masks of all were not worn by the accused. They were worn by the ones who believed they acted on behalf of heaven. Evil does not always come with black candles, cursed books, or whispered spells under a red moon. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in silence, in paperwork, in the shrug of a neighbor. Sometimes evil is not in the ritual, but in how easily we forget that the accused had names, voices, families, souls. Among the dozens who were charged, there were those whose names still linger, like faint fingerprints on frosted glass. Not because they were witches, but because they were human, cast into the fire not for what they had done, but for what others feared. Sarah Good. Poor, unwanted wandering. She begged on doorsteps. She muttered to herself. She didn't smile the right way. She didn't walk the right way. And in Salem, not being right was already enough to be dangerous. When they came for her, she was pregnant. Locked in a cold cell, she waited, hungry, bruised, forgotten. Her young daughter was with her, barely old enough to understand why. The judges asked, "Why does your child speak of black cats, Sarah?" She didn't answer. "Did you teach her the devil's words?" She denied everything, but no one heard her. She cried, pleaded, shouted that she was innocent, that she was nothing more than a poor woman with no one left to protect her. She was hanged in July. Her child died in prison. Rebecca Nurse, an old woman, deaf in one ear, gentle hands, warm voice, a midwife, a mother, a grandmother. She had spent her life tending to the sick and praying for others. But kindness wasn't protection. All it took was a neighbor's accusation, claiming Rebecca had cursed her into illness. And then the girl screamed in court, "Her spirit is tearing me apart. She wants me dead." The community was divided. Many knew her, trusted her, believed in her innocence. Even the governor hesitated. The verdict was briefly overturned, but the crowd was loud, the fear louder. And in the end, the rope was tied. Her final words were quiet, almost inaudible. "I am innocent. God knows it." Giles Corey, stubborn, hardened, a farmer with hands shaped like stone. They accused him too. But Giles refused to speak at all, refused to plead, refused to play the game. They tortured him slowly, a form of execution not often used, pressing. Heavy stones placed on his chest, one by one, breath by breath. "Confess," they told him. He looked them in the eye and said, "More weight." He died without a confession, not because he was proud, not because he was cruel, but because he would not give them the thing they wanted. And in doing so, he became a monument, a grave made of defiance. These people were not monsters. They were not spellcasters or sorcerers. They were mothers, fathers, neighbors. They lit candles at night. They baked bread. They tended gardens. They held hands in prayer. And what killed them was not magic. It was accusation, suspicion, and the silence of those who knew better but said nothing. Today, some say their spirits never left Salem. That on cold mornings, when the mist rolls low across the woods, you can hear names floating in the hush of the trees. Sarah, Rebecca, Giles. And if you stop and listen, really listen, you'll realize these are not ghosts. They are conscience. By the autumn of 1692, Salem was no longer Salem. It had hollowed itself out. The village streets, once filled with the sound of work and worship, had gone silent. The fields were neglected. The churches half empty. The gallows had done their work too well. And even those who had cheered the loudest began to ask, quietly, what exactly they had been cheering for. The machinery of the trials had started with whispers, then snowballed into screams, into arrests, into nooses. But like all storms, even this one had to burn itself out. It didn't happen all at once. It didn't end because of justice. It ended because the weight of the horror became too much to ignore. It began to crumble when the wrong people started dying. At first, the accused had been outsiders. The poor, the different, the strange. But as the accusations multiplied, the noose tightened around people of standing. Those with wealth, good names, land. Martha Corey, a respected member of the church, was hanged. John Proctor, a landowner and outspoken critic of the court, was dragged to execution. His pregnant wife, Elizabeth, was spared only because of the child in her womb. The cracks grew wider. One of the most respected judges in the colony, Samuel Sewall, began to question what he had signed. Quiet conversations started behind closed doors. Ministers who had once praised the court began to murmur doubts in their sermons. And then, finally, a voice loud enough to shake the scaffolding. Increase Mather, father of Cotton Mather himself. It was Increase Mather who stood before the governor and declared, "It is better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person be condemned." It was the reversal of the very phrase that had set the trials ablaze. And for the first time the words landed like water on fire. Governor William Phipps, who had allowed the court to run freely while away on military matters, returned and saw what had been done in his name. By October, he dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer, the special tribunal created to handle witchcraft cases. Future trials would be different. Spectral evidence was no longer admissible. And with that, the hysteria, publicly at least, began to lose its grip. But the damage had already been done. In less than a year, over 200 people had been accused. 19 had been hanged. 1 Giles Corey had been pressed to death. 5 had died in prison. Families were torn apart. Land was seized. Reputation shattered. Some who survived the accusations would never recover. They lived in the margins of a town that no longer knew what to do with them. The people of Salem didn't talk about what happened. Not at first. There were no public apologies. No days of mourning. Just silence. A silence so thick it became a second kind of death. But silence cannot last forever. Years later, Samuel Sewall, one of the original judges, stood in church and publicly confessed his guilt. He fasted, he prayed, he wore sackcloth in private penance. Others followed more slowly. In 1702, the trials were officially declared unlawful. In 1711, a bill was passed to restore the rights and names of those accused, along with modest financial reparations to their families. But money could not unhang a neck, could not bring back the dead. The wound in Salem did not close easily. It didn't become a scar. It became something else, deeper, harder to name. A sense that something terrible had been allowed to happen, and that everyone had played a part. The nightmare ended not with justice but with fatigue, with quiet, with the slow, reluctant realization that the devil had never been in the jail cells. He had been in the courtroom. The town tried to move on. People changed the subject. Time passed, but history remembers what people try to forget. And long after the last noose was taken down, the last name cleared, and the last paper sealed in the governor's hand, Salem remained haunted. Not by ghosts, but by memory. The execution stopped. The court was dissolved. The gallows stood quiet. But the silence that followed in Salem was not peace, it was paralysis. There was no celebration, no ceremony, no declaration that the nightmare was truly over. People simply stopped speaking of it, as if silence could cover the blood that had already soaked into the ground. As if forgetting could erase what had happened when the wind had turned cold and the trees had grown bare and neighbors had led neighbors to the rope. The town changed, but not visibly. The buildings remained. The fields grew again. The church bells rang. Children were born, marriages held, windows mended. Life moved forward. But something underneath had shifted, like a fault line silently cracking below cobblestones. Salem did not mourn. It flinched. Those who had spoken too loudly during the trials now spoke in careful tones. Those who had remained quiet stayed quieter still. Families of the accused found their homes treated like plague houses. People crossed the street to avoid eye contact. No one wanted to admit it, but the truth lay heavy in the air. No one had been untouched by what happened. Some, like Judge Samuel Sewall, tried to carry the weight openly. He stood before his congregation and confessed, aloud, to the part he had played in condemning innocence. He fasted. He wore black cloth under his clothes in secret mourning. And every year, on the anniversary of the trials, he would retreat from the world to pray alone. But not everyone followed his lead. Cotton Mather, whose sermons had once stirred the flames, never truly apologized. He softened. He stepped back. But he never admitted that his words had helped kill people. His father, Increase Mather, had spoken against the court once it began to devour the wrong people. But even he had remained silent at first. The hierarchy that had lit the fire now watched it smolder from a distance. Over time, the colony attempted to heal itself. In 1702, the government declared that the trials had been unlawful. In 1711, financial reparations were issued to some families of the victims. The names of 22 accused were officially cleared. But what was justice so long delayed? A name restored on paper does not unbreak a family. It does not dry the tears of a daughter who watched her mother hanged. It does not fill the empty seat at a supper table year after year. The survivors carried their own invisible sentences. Elizabeth Proctor, whose life had been spared only because she was pregnant at the time of her condemnation, lived on with a hollow kind of grief, knowing that her husband, John Proctor, had died for speaking the truth she hadn't been able to shout loudly enough. Children of the hanged grew up in a town that wouldn't look them in the eye. Wives remarried. Husbands stayed silent. And the fields, once soaked with fear, turned green again quietly as if trying to forget. But the world did not forget. Years passed. The colonies became a country. New wars came, new cities rose, and Salem faded into history. But its name remained, etched not in triumph but in caution. By the 19th century, the word Salem no longer meant just a town. It had become a symbol. A parable. A warning whispered in courtrooms and classrooms. Of what happens when fear replaces reason, when faith becomes a weapon, and when people stop asking questions. Writers came. Historians. Poets. Playwrights. Nathaniel Hawthorne, descended from one of the judges, added a W to his name, Hathorne to Hawthorne, in silent protest of his ancestors' shame. In the 20th century, Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible, using Salem to mirror the paranoia of his own age. Again and again people return to the story. Not to relive it, but to understand it. Or try to. Because Salem is more than a place. It is a mirror. And sometimes what we see in it is too familiar. Today the town wears its history uneasily. Tourists walk the cobbled streets, drawn to the legend. Ghost tours wind past gravestones. Souvenir shops sell broomsticks and spell books. But just beneath the surface, the real story lingers. Quiet. Sober. Still asking questions no one can answer. How did it happen? Why did they believe? And what would we have done? The legacy of Salem isn't just in the records or the museums. It's in the uneasy feeling that it could happen again. Under a different name. With different words. But the same silence. Because the worst part of history is not when it's forgotten. It's when it's repeated. Centuries have passed since the nooses were untied. Since the court was dissolved and the fires cooled. Since names were whispered not as accusations but as memories. But Salem never truly returned to silence. Not entirely. There are places in the world where history doesn't rest. Where something in the ground, whether ash, sorrow, or bone, refuses to be buried. Salem is one of those places. The town that once tore itself apart has become something else now. Part living community, part remembered nightmare. It wears its past like a second skin. You can walk its streets, buy postcards with broomsticks on them, sit in cafes where the walls are hung with black cats and crescent moons. But the deeper you go, the more the air changes. Something colder. Older. Tourists come drawn by the word witch. By the mystique. The story. Some come with curiosity. Some with reverence. Some chasing ghosts. And maybe they find them. Or maybe the ghosts find them first. Because there are places where the quiet feels too heavy. Where wind moves without trees. Where the shadows don't quite match the light. They say that the land remembers. That a place soaked in fear and silence becomes porous. That pain seeps into the wood, the soil, the walls. That even when the people have gone, the memory remains. Some say they've seen Sarah Good walking the hill before dawn, her skirts torn, her hands clutching air. Others claim to hear Rebecca Nurse praying softly in the ruins of her homestead, her voice thin but calm, repeating her innocence to no one. There are stories of Giles Corey, still lurking near the site where he was crushed, his voice never raised but always saying the same thing, more weight. Even the jail where they once waited for trial, its foundations still exist, now underneath another building. But people claim the rooms above it go cold without reason. That footsteps echo long after the last visitor leaves. Are these spirits? Or just guilt? Does the wind carry voices? Or do we invent them because we know they should have spoken louder in their time? The truth is, Salem is haunted. Not by witches, but by what we let happen to them. There is no curse in Salem. No spell that clings to the soil. The haunting is quieter than that. It's in the questions we still ask. In the unease that follows us out of museums and court transcripts. In the realization that what happened here was not mystical, but painfully human. That the devil never needed to appear. Because fear did the work for him. And yet, Salem still searches for meaning. It has become a symbol for everything from injustice to mass hysteria, from religious extremism to moral failure. It's been used in books and films, in plays and protests. Every generation finds its own reflection in the trials. And every generation wonders if it would have stood still, or spoken out. In October, the town fills with lights and laughter. Halloween makes it glow. Children in pointed hats run down cobbled alleys. But beneath the celebration, beneath the joy, there's always a shadow. Not to ruin the fun, but to remind that this is not just a story. It was never just a story. 20 people were executed, dozens more imprisoned, hundreds scarred by fear, shame, and silence. And if you visit the memorial, you'll find 20 granite benches, one for each of the executed. Their names carved, plain and unsentimental. But read closely and you'll see something else etched beside the dates. Words. Final words. Spoken before the rope tightened. I am no witch. God knows I am innocent. More weight. They echo not as cries of fear, but as anchors of truth in a world that refused to hear it. And that, perhaps, is the real haunting. That truth spoke softly and we let it die. So Salem endures. Not in shadows but in memory. Not as a place of evil but as a reminder of what fear can justify, and what silence can allow. Periodically cities disappear. Not because of fire. Not because of war. And not because anyone forgot them. They vanish, in silence. No warning. No record. Just gone. As if they had never been there at all. Tonight, we travel to one of those places. To a city buried in the heart of the Arabian desert. A place once called the Atlantis of the Sands. Its name was Ubar. Long ago, they said it shimmered with towers of marble. The air hung heavy with the scent of frankincense. And caravans came from every corner of the known world. And then, nothing. A void in history. A whisper in scripture. A name carried only by the wind. But in time the sands began to shift. And beneath them, something stirred. So tonight, let your breath soften. Let the stillness of the desert settle around you. And follow the trail. To a city that vanished, but may never have truly been gone. This is why you wouldn't survive the sands of Ubar. The first thing you feel is heat. Not the kind that fades, but a heat that settles on your skin, presses into your lungs and refuses to leave. You're standing at the edge of a great trading city, Ubar. The city of no need, or so the stories say. Everything the body could want is here. Gold, water, fragrance, shelter. Even the wind seems to carry a scent of sweetness. But beneath the shimmer, life is hard. You wake before the sun crests over the dunes. The air is dry, not cold, not warm, just still. In your home, frankincense is packed in clay jars, its scent soaked into the very walls. It's thick, sacred, slightly bitter. You work with it all day, grinding, sorting, wrapping it in waxed cloth to be tied onto the backs of camels bound for distant cities. The market is loud, but you barely speak. You're tired. You've been carrying bundles from the oasis since dawn. Sand clings to your lashes even when there's no wind. And always the heat. Water is rationed. The city's reservoir lies deep below, hand-carved and ancient. You've never seen it, only heard the stories. Some say the stone is weakening. That if you stand still enough, you can hear the earth groan. You don't believe in such things. Not really. But sometimes late at night you hear something, low moans, shifting sounds in the dark. The elders say the ground remembers. That Ubar has grown too proud. But you don't speak of it. Not aloud. Still the day presses on. Caravans arrive from Yemen. Tall camels with bells on their necks, their backs heavy with silver, myrrh, and dyed cloth. Traders call the city blessed. They say it shines like no other. But quietly, one by one, some are beginning to leave. They say the wells along the incense road are failing. That ships now move faster than the desert ever could. You feel the tension even as you smile and survive. You trade. You carry on. But every evening, a little more sand piles at the corners of the streets. Every week, fewer caravans pass through the gates. And every night, the air feels just a little more hollow. After sunset, you lie down. The scent of oil lamps mingles with the last of the warm dust. You don't know what's coming. No one does. But deep beneath your feet, something shifts. The reservoir creaks. Its foundation begins to crack. And the city, this bright, blessed city, is already starting to fall. You didn't know it then. But one day the story would say, your city vanished overnight. That it was swallowed by divine wrath. That it simply ceased. But every fall has a beginning. And now, let us drift deeper. To the story told beside desert fires. Of towers lost and cities buried in sand. The vanishing city, what NASA found beneath the sand. For centuries, the name Ubar lived only in whispers, spoken quietly beside campfires, woven into poetry and echoed in ancient scripture. It was a legend passed down through generations. But to scholars and scientists, it was something else entirely. A beautiful, mysterious story, yes, but still only a myth. Like Atlantis or El Dorado. A tale told by dreamers, not by historians. That was the general belief, until the closing years of the 20th century when something began to shift. Not in an academic institution or royal archive, but in the hands of a man who wasn't an archaeologist at all. His name was Nicholas Clapp, a filmmaker by trade, a passionate amateur explorer by heart, and someone who his friends fondly called the real-life Indiana Jones. While reading through old expedition notes, Clapp came across a reference to Ubar in the journals of Bertram Thomas, a British explorer who had traveled through Arabia in the 1930s. Thomas had heard local Bedouins speak of a city that had once stood proud but had been swallowed by the sands. He believed their stories but lacked the technology to pursue them further. Clapp, however, lived in a different era, one where satellites orbited the Earth. In 1992, he reached out to an unexpected partner, NASA. At the time, the space agency had been experimenting with satellite radar imaging, a technology that could detect ancient caravan routes buried deep beneath layers of sand. Clapp posed a simple question. Could these tools developed for space be turned toward the desert? Could they reveal the forgotten paths of the incense trade? The answer was yes. From orbit, the satellites scanned the southern Arabian Peninsula. At first, there was nothing, just shifting sand. But slowly, faint traces began to appear. Barely visible paths, worn into the earth over thousands of years by the feet of countless camels, began to emerge. And remarkably, many of those ancient trails began to converge, dozens of them, all leading to a single, unremarkable point on the map. That point was called Shizr. A lonely place deep within the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, one of the most desolate and remote regions on Earth. Clapp assembled a team. Archaeologists, geophysicists, military engineers, and Bedouin guides who knew the desert better than any satellite ever could. Together, they followed the coordinates and set off into the dunes. At first glance, there was nothing. Just dust, stone, and endless heat. But beneath their feet, the ground told a different story. They discovered ruins, fragments of foundations, a rectangular layout, traces of ancient walls and collapsed towers. It wasn't much, but it was something. And at the very center of the site, a hole. A massive sinkhole more than 20 meters deep. Long ago, it had been a reservoir, hand-carved, reinforced with stone, a lifeline for the people who once lived here. But it had collapsed. Not recently. Ages ago. And when the reservoir gave way, the city above it followed. Homes, markets, streets, everything gone in an instant. The old legends had claimed that the earth had swallowed Ubar whole. And now, in that open wound in the desert floor, there was evidence. All around the site, the team began uncovering fragments. Pottery, incense burners, beads, tools, and personal belongings long forgotten by time. This wasn't just a pit stop for caravans. It had been a city. A real one. Busy. Complex. Alive. And then, suddenly silent. Some researchers were quick to call it the discovery of Ubar. Others, more cautious, suggested that while it may not be the Ubar of legend, it was still something vital, something central to the incense trade. A crossroads of culture. A place that rose in importance, and then vanished. Not in metaphor, not in fantasy, but in stone. And then, perhaps the most haunting question of all emerged. What does it mean for a city to fall? Not by war, not by fire, but simply because it could no longer hold itself together. Next, we turn to the people of Ubar. The merchants, the leaders, the ones who once believed their city would last forever. And how, even with gold in their hands, they could not stop the desert from rising. From empire to echo, how civilizations end. Once, Ubar stood as a beacon in the desert. Not merely a waypoint for weary travelers, but a symbol of wealth, permanence, and pride. It was a city crowned with towers, a marketplace where fragrance mingled with gold, where names were made and fortunes exchanged in the dry heat of ancient trade. Its upper halls echoed with the footsteps of merchant princes, men who didn't just lead caravans but owned them. They sat on rugs woven with silver thread, surrounded by the scent of frankincense and the soft rustle of silk, believing with quiet certainty that their city would outlive even the stars themselves. But power has never been a safeguard against decline. Picture, if you will, a banquet. Long wooden tables beneath woven canopies, Dates soaked in honey, cool jugs of water drawn from deep desert wells. Incense burning gently in every corner. The air thick with spice and sweetness. Laughter soft, never forced. Every gesture, every bite, designed to reflect abundance. These were the final days of comfort. They didn't realize it yet, but the world outside Ubar had already begun to change. The desert, which had once given so generously, now began to take. Rain became scarce. The trees that gave resin for incense withered, slowly but steadily. And far beneath the city, the great reservoir, the lifeblood of Ubar, began to creak. Above, however, life continued. The perfumers still ground their incense. The traders still argued beneath their colorful awnings. Noblemen signed new routes, counted coin, and performed rituals of prosperity as though nothing had shifted. But fewer caravans arrived, and more wells ran dry. Beyond the dunes, new ports were rising. Ships could carry what camels once did, faster, safer, and at far less cost. A quiet whisper began moving through the upper halls of Ubar's elite. Maybe the city was no longer essential. But no one dared speak it aloud. Not yet. The pride built over centuries does not vanish overnight. And so Ubar pressed forward. The rituals continued. The incense moved slower, cost more, and meant less. The sand crept higher each year. Then one night, everything changed. Perhaps it was sudden. A tremor beneath the city, a thunderous groan rising from deep within the earth. Or perhaps it was gradual, walls cracking over months, doors shifting in their frames, roads buckling, until at last the entire foundation gave way in silence. What matters is not how it began. What matters is that no one stopped it. Because no one could. And so the towers collapsed. The water ran dry. The wind returned. And the people scattered. Some fled east, others west. Some stayed behind only to leave again. And what remained? Very little. A few outlines in stone. A few memories clung to like relics. And a name. Ubar. Because not every end comes with fire. Some come softly. Like sleep. Like drifting. Like forgetting. No empire is too grand to be lost. No city too mighty to vanish beneath the sand. And when the survivors spoke to their children, they didn't mention failed infrastructure. They didn't discuss trade routes or shifting economies or politics. They spoke of punishment, of wrath, of the day the earth opened and swallowed the city whole. And that story, that part, survived. Because sometimes what truly matters is not the fall itself, but the remembering, the legend, the lesson, and the hush that remains.